So Michael, some audience members might know you for your previous book from 2013, Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us, which ends like this. It is perhaps not unreasonable to think of the grocery store as a battlefield dotted with landmines itching to go off. They, the food industry, may have salt, sugar, and fat on their side, but we ultimately have the power to make choices. After all, we decide what to buy, and we decide how much to eat. Your new book, Hooked, complicates the well, not only is it hiding in the subtitle of your previous book, but it complicates these 3 points, right? We have the power to make choices, we decide how much to buy, we decide how much to eat. Tell us how your thinking has evolved over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that noise, by the way, if you're, well, all our viewers can see what's going on. I brought some of my friends to talk about as well. I tried so hard at the end of Salt, Sugar, Fat to have a little optimism and a little hope for the future with that phrases. And I think it was the very first interview I did when the book came out, because I think the British edition came out maybe a little bit earlier than the American, and a British TV reporter said to me, well, actually the first thing he said to me, "So, Michael Moss, have they sued you yet?" In the classic British way of like in your face, right? And then the second question was, and so you write here at the end of the book that, ultimately information is power, and by reading this book, people will be able to make better decisions about what to eat and how much. But he says, isn't this food you write about as addictive as drugs? And I had sort of shied away from the A word because it seemed to me that it was too caustic, and the idea of comparing Twinkies to heroin seemed ludicrous. But he got me interested in that notion because the numbers are just kind of so staggering. I mean, before the pandemic in the United States, 42% of American adults were clinically obese, which is a very crude way of measuring your health, but nonetheless, that meant nearly 1 in 2 adults were losing control of their eating to the extent to which they were at least 35 pounds, and in many cases, much more overweight. And then you look at things like type 2 diabetes and gout on the rise, and on and on. So as a public health disaster, there's sort of nothing that really exceeds our over dependency on processed foods. And so when I started to dig into, and then this other thing sort of happened too with salt, sugar, fat, the first book, I focused on those 3 ingredients as this unholy trinity on which the food industry relies on to get us to not just love their products, but to want more and more, right? And so, but what happened since the book came out, just kind of coincidentally, more and more people are caring about what they're eating. And as a result, the food companies started cutting back on the amounts of salt, sugar, fat that they were putting in their products. And yet, if anything, our trouble with food only increased since then. And so when this TV reporter sort of put that addiction thing to me, I thought, God. And when I went to Nestle, in Switzerland, and they impressed upon me all the ways they were trying to cut back on salt, sugar, fat, I thought, God, maybe I missed something here, right?
Right. So this is really interesting. And so actually the opening story of the book turns on, as you say, this A word, the word of addiction. The book opens with the story of Jaslyn Bradley, represented by Samuel Hirsch, suing a lawsuit against McDonald's in 2002. And Hirsch looks to the tobacco industry for inspiration about how to handle this, because he's tried various things. It's not necessarily working. And so he essentially likens people who eat McDonald's to those who smoke cigarettes. He argues that they're hampered in their decision-making due to this keyword addiction. And so this is a term that was previously, before it was applied to smoking, and it had to be applied to smoking, it was previously reserved for illegal drugs and alcohol. So addiction, of course, shifts the blame from the consumer back to the companies. In the case of cigarettes, it did it again, possibly Hirsch was hoping in the case of food. How do you define addiction? And why for you is it really at the center and the key of this book?
Yeah, I mean, starting out the reporting, I thought addiction was basically, having one bit of heroin and ending up in the gutter. I mean, that sort of like complete loss of control with withdrawal symptoms and threshold to a point where you have to eat and consume more and more to get sort of the same high. But it turns out that addiction is a very kind of loose term that professionals tend to shy away from too. They talk about sort of dependency on drugs and products. But I was incredibly lucky because as I discovered in Salt, Sugar, Fat, one of the main characters, biggest characters in the world of processed foods was none other than the biggest tobacco company, Philip Morris, which for years and years was also the single largest manufacturer of processed food, which was great for me because there was a whole archive of material relating to tobacco that I was able to look at in the context of Philip Morris's ownership of General Foods, the old company, then Kraft, and then Nabisco, Oreo cookies, etc. And at one point in the year 2000, the CEO of Philip Morris was in a legal proceeding, and the plaintiff's attorney asked him, so what's your definition of addiction? And I'm reading that, I'm going, yeah, here's an expert on addiction. Let's see what he says. And his answer was, addiction is a repetitive behavior that some people find difficult to quit. And I thought that was so perfect for his own products, food products, but also tobacco and alcohol. And as I sort of dug into how addiction looks in those scenes, I mean, as we know, there are people who can drink casually. There are people who can smoke one cigarette a day and put the pack away and never have. The chief legal counsel of Philip Morris was fantastic. I named Steve Parrish as an interview, because we sat down and he goes, Michael, I'm one of those lucky people who can smoke like one cigarette a day, put the pack away, and I won't think about it until the next business meeting when I just kind of want to have another cigarette. But he says, I couldn't go near a box or bag of our Oreo cookies. Remember, they made Oreo cookies too, without completely losing control. And so addiction is kind of this sliding thing where kind of depending on where you are in terms of your ability to kind of remain in control of your actions, and depending on the substance and lots of different factors, it can affect you. A product can affect you or can't affect you. So I love that definition.
Yeah.
Because not everything with addictive properties will affect everybody as harshly and in the same way.
And so why for you is it the right word to describe many people's relationship to food?
Yeah, because I think you can use something softer like hooked, and I think like in some situations maybe that is a better thing. But I think addiction is absolutely perfect. I mean, I came full circle to be convinced that not only is it not ludicrous to compare Twinkies to heroin, in some ways these food products are engineered in ways that are even more trouble for us than tobacco and alcohol and maybe some drugs. And that's a lot of what kind of Hooked goes into, is how they went beyond, the companies, the formulation of these ingredients to really figure out what's in our heads.
Great. So let's talk about this. And even more trouble, you might add, than what you previously thought in your previous book.
Absolutely.
Right?
Oh, it's much worse than I thought.
Much worse than you thought.
Yeah,
and much worse than your conclusion, your hopeful,
that
happy
last
conclusion.
sentence was totally bogus. I mean, they have our number in ways I just never imagined.
So let's talk about it, Michael. So you write in your introduction, the aim is to lay out all that the companies have done to exploit our addiction to food so that we might reverse engineer our dependence. And in the interest of time, there are kind of three main ways. The first one is speed. We were talking about it back there. So in your second chapter, where does it begin? You point out that while the smoke from cigarettes takes 10 seconds to stir the brain, a touch of sugar on the tongue takes little more than half a second. Tell us how big food has sped up everything from manufacturing plants to production times to biological pathways. And why does it, as you write, addict and kill? I mean, you're being polemical.
So just to turn it around a little bit. So speed, when you talk to people who study drug addiction, some of whom are now studying food from a addictive perspective. The hallmark of addiction is speed. So the faster a substance hits the brain, the more excited the brain will get, and the more apt we are to lose control and overconsume that substance. So speed is something that, and it's sort of why people moved from snorting cocaine to smoking crack cocaine, because that was hitting the brain faster and providing more buzz and more excitement to the brain. It's just sort of as simple as that. And recognizing that then as speed being the hallmark, I've sort of come to call the products in the grocery store that are problematic fast groceries, much like fast food. And everything about them is designed for speed, right? The manufacturing process, the dairy industry is proud of having discovered a way to make processed cheese in one day. And they have this little slogan like, milk in, cheese out. We're talking about processed cheese. Velveeta, did you have Velveeta as a kid? It didn't hit England like it did Fresno, California, where I was a young teenager. So the manufacturing process is designed to make the manufacturing as efficient as possible, for another reason we'll talk about as an essential ingredient here in the way that they hook us on food. And then there's the packaging. So I went shopping just down the street, by the way, and was thrilled to see that these guys have invaded
You call them your friends. You have an amicable
and with
relationship.
like one hand, I don't hope I could do it with one hand. Yeah, absolutely. This is designed, these boxes. They even made the boxes bigger and wider so you could put your hand in, right, absent-mindedly while you're doing something else, playing computer games or talking to Alice, right? And not load up. Oh my God. Where is that? So the packaging is designed for speed and convenience. And we'll talk about kind of, and remind me to talk about sort of the ways you can tell, problematic foods in the store and better for you foods. But one of the things is sort of the ease with which you can get your paws in there and eat the products. And then, as you mentioned, the speed is also.
Are you feeling the hit?
Yeah, it's coming on. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned to you, I'm more of a salt and fat kind of guy than a sugar. So that's right. These really do it for me. And if we talk about salt, sugar, fat, which is Chris' book, we'll have somebody in the audience who can test these out for us and see how good the French versions are. But
so yeah, keep telling us about speed.
yeah, so the formulation, this kind of goes back to salt, sugar, fat too, which is that those three ingredients are designed in absolutely exquisite formulations to maximize their allure, but also to maximize the speed which they hit the brain. And you mentioned that somebody, did this incredible experiment that sat people down and they said, look, we want to measure how fast you sense the taste of sweetness. And so they put a dab of sugar on their tongue and they asked them, as soon as you detect sweetness, push this button. And you mentioned that cigarette smoke can take as long as 10 seconds to fully engage the brain. Well, these people in this experiment were getting the dab of sugar in their tongue and pushing the button in less than 1 second, half a second. Because, and here's where the reporting for it got really interesting. The reason that is that we are designed to be attracted to food. So it's not that the sugar is going directly to the brain, it's that it's triggering this electrical impulse that's in your taste buds, and that's sending that electrical impulse to the brain, and then the brain sends that another electrical impulse to your fingers, so you're pushing the button. And that was sort of a key moment of revelation for me, because what these companies have done, besides designing exquisite formulations of salt, which they called the flavor burst, because it's typically the first thing that hits the tongue and sends those electrical signals, and the fat, which they call the mouth feel, which doesn't hit the taste buds, but rather gets picked up by the trigeminal nerve, which in the roof of your mouth, and it goes to the brain. And then sugar they call the bliss point, because when they hit that most perfect amount of sweetness, it's also activating the brain. And they also discovered that if you combined fat and sugar in products, which you don't find in nature, then you get this fantastic situation where people can't tell how much they're eating, and the little part of your brain that tells you you're overdoing it, you better stop, slow down, like, goes to sleep. And so their formulas are designed in a way that not only maximizes the yes part of your brain, which is the go part of the brain, which prompts you to do things even if it's not in your interest, and minimize kind of your ability to kind of stay in control. But all of that, when I started meeting sort of evolutionary biologists, and they started telling me about how we're designed, right, to not just want to eat, but to overeat, then I realized these companies are like really in our heads.
As if it hadn't already been so bad. But
Yeah.
this is great because this goes into memory, and there are kind of two main ways that you talk about memory in the book. There's this, as you say, this biological memory, millions of years. These are pathways passed down of millions of years, and then there's also our own personal childhood memory. So this, in its loveliest form, is the Proust Madeleine. I'm sure you all know this. He eats a Madeleine in the book, and he's transported back to his childhood. In the most malign way, these companies are exploiting our own childhood memories. Can you talk about these two memories in the vast spectrum of time?
Yeah, so there is well, it's kind of the most recent one, I think, that I found kind of most compelling. And this happened for me personally. I was visiting Kellogg's in Battle Creek, Michigan, and I was looking and reporting on something else, but we went into their research development factory.
Do you have to go in disguise?
Do it what?
Do you have to go in disguise to these companies? Surely they know who you are by now.
No, they knew who I was, but they didn't quite. Well, I'll tell you another story about that. I'll tell you why I was in Kellogg's, because this is kind of interesting. So early on the reporting for salt, sugar, fat, I kind of realized that I had this question, which was, salt, for instance, had become like this public enemy #1 because of its ties to high blood pressure and heart disease. And I kind of just went to the companies and said, like, why, with so many people caring about salt, are you putting so much salt in your products? Why don't you just take it out? And so they, thinking they were being very clever, invited me in, and this includes Kellogg's. And not only did they sit me down and talk to me about why they're adding so much salt, but they wanted to show me. So they made special versions of their biggest selling products. But in this case, they left all the salt out together, thinking they were going to get Michael Moss, right? They're going to really show him. And, as I write in the book, it was the most god-awful tasting experience I ever had. And I don't want to belabor it, but we started with the Cheez-Its, which normally I could eat day in and day out, and the ones without salt stuck to the roofs of our mouth. We couldn't swallow them because salt adds texture and solubility. We went on to the frozen waffles. Without salt, they came out tasting and looking like straw because salt adds color and taste. Moved on to the cornflakes, added milk, took a bite, and before I could say anything, the chief spokeswoman is sitting there, right? And she gets this look of horror on her face, swallows and blurts out the word metal, metal. I taste metal. Hang on.
I'm dying.
Yeah. And I go, and as I mentioned today to some of my colleagues, I thought one of my who've joined us tonight, I thought one of the fillings in my mouth had fallen out. It was like sloshing around because I was tasting that too. But this guy sitting with us was the chief technical officer, who's the head scientist in charge of all the science. He starts laughing. He goes like, not everybody will taste that. But one of the beautiful things about salt for us is that it will mask, cover up some of the off notes, bad tastes that are inherent to many processed foods. And that's when a light bulb went on in reporting the first book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, which is I came away from that thinking, these companies are more hooked on using gobs of salt, sugar, fat for their products, far beyond just like the taste, far more hooked than we are. And I thought that was a really surprising and interesting concept. And so I was in that factory talking about salt. We're walking across the floor, and this aroma comes wafting across the floor, right? And instantly, that took me back 40 plus years to my days as a latchkey kid when I would come home from elementary school, let myself in, go to the kitchen and put a strawberry Pop Tart in the toaster. And indeed, that's what they were experimenting with on the other side of the factory floor. But that power of memory, right, is so strong that it remains in our heads. Those Pop Tarts, even though I hadn't had one in 40 years, never left my head. And kind of what happens, scientists will explain to you, is that the more you do something, the more you consume something, or the more action is, the deeper you carve those memory channels so that you'll be more apt to respond to what psychologists call a cue, right? And that can be a good thing. If you're trying to like get your kids to eat broccoli, right? My wife always joked that we just have to feed them like 19 times. And then, but it's some number like that. And what's going on is you're sort of deepening their memory channels. I'll give you another example, though, a bleaker example during the pandemic, right? Some of us thought that we were at least going to escape one of the most treacherous corners of processed food, which was like the vending machine at work, which in the United States is just horrific, as maybe it is here, right? But what happened was we turned our kitchen cupboards into vending machines, much to the delight of the processed food industry. We went shopping, and under the emotional strain of the pandemic, we started buying all of this stuff that we hadn't eaten, this stuff, since we were kids, because of the cue of the pandemic causing us that emotional stress, which triggered our memory for those products, and the sales of those products soared.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Tell us also about the biological grooves. So you talked about your childhood memories, but there are other grooves, deep, million-year long grooves.
Yeah, right. One of the fabulous sources in Hooked is a research scientist who studies the brain. Her name is Dana Small. She ended up at McGill in Montreal studying. She was the first person who very cleverly figured out how to look at the brain on food, because normally when you slide people into a medical scanner called the fMRI, you have to lie perfectly still, or the movement will fuzz out the data, and you can't see anything. But Dana, being a self-confessed, professed, described chocoholic, right, realized she could feed her subjects squares of chocolate, especially if it's milk chocolate, and they could lie there perfectly still, and the chocolate would melt in their mouth, right, while they didn't move. And she could then see their brains respond. It was a fantastic research project that she did as just a recent graduate, that made her famous in the world of neuroscience. And ever since, she's been studying sort of our relationship to food as it's decipherable through our brain reaction, especially. But Dana kind of pushed back on me on this question of addiction when I asked her, as I did many people, like, do you think this stuff is addictive? And she says, Michael, I don't view these products as so much as being addictive as I do that we by nature are addicted or drawn to food, if you are, and are drawn not just to want to eat, but to overeat. And the problem is the food companies have so dramatically changed the nature of our food environment in the last 50 years, um, to make eating an everyday thing, that our biology hasn't caught up. And so she kind of views this whole problem as a mix match between our biology, which can only change slowly through genetics, and the fast moving environment that these companies kind of create for us. And so for example, we by nature, deep nature and deep biology, are drawn to food that's cheap, in the sense requiring the least energy expenditure on our part.
Convenient.
It's evolving on the plains of the Rift Valley. It made perfect sense that instead of trying to chase down an antelope for dinner, we would just grab that poor aardvark sitting there and eat that, right? Going to kind of the easiest food we can get. And so what do the food companies do? They have these chemical laboratories working for them called flavor houses, which find and mix and match the chemical ingredients that they use to mimic the taste, the flavors of real food. But their overarching goal for the companies is to reduce the price of the product, because they know that when we go in the grocery store, and that box of Pop-Tarts is 15 cents less than it was last week, our brain, in that deep biological attraction to cheapness, is going to get really excited about that and we'll buy it. The second thing that we really have a deep biological instinct for is variety. It's why people were able to move around the world and live in lots of different places. And if all you had was whale blubber to eat, you would get excited by whale blubber, right? And so what do the food companies do, including the grocery stores here in lovely Paris? They, invented the cereal aisle where there's 200 versions of sugary starch, giving us that impression of variety, which is like this basic instinct. And maybe the biggest way that they've tapped into our natural biology is that we by nature love calories. We have sensors in the tongue, possibly in the gut, that tell us how many calories there are in the stuff we're eating. More calories, the better, because for most of our existence, getting calories was like a life and death thing. Putting on body fat was a really good thing up until, again, like the last 50 years, when food became overeating. But well, it was a good thing because you knew that drought was coming or famine was going, and it wouldn't be an everyday thing. And so what do the companies do? They designed these, especially snack foods, that are loaded with calories, which we get excited about, knowing that we haven't evolved the biology to help us tell the difference between junk food calories and healthy calories.
Very bleak. We're going to go take one more bleak step, and then we'll pull it all back and talk about possible solutions. The third area that they exploit is the diet industry and dieting, which is a $34 billion industry worldwide. It's a really sick logic, because it's the same companies who are creating this processed food that make people overweight, that then develop new brands selling low-calorie foods and kind of lifestyles. So Nestle, I learned this because of this fantastic book. Nestle, the creator of chocolate bars and Hot Pockets, also comes out with a line of lower calorie meals called Lean Cuisine. Kraft, famously of macaroni and cheese, also Kool-Aid and the Oreo cookie, as you can eat here for breakfast. Also, if you're interested, if you want to maybe eat some of that and then go on a diet, you could buy Kraft's South Beach diet. Can you tell us about the diet industry and how they're manipulating us in that terrain?
Yeah, I used to always have a disclaimer in my talks. Not a disclaimer, but in trying to be fair to this industry, right? I would say something like, at the end of the day, I don't view this industry as this evil empire that intentionally set out to make us usually overweight or otherwise sick on their products, right? These are companies doing what most companies want to do, which is to sell as much product, make as much money as possible by selling as much product as possible, by making that product as highly alluring as possible. But when I found out that none other than Heinz, which was sort of famous for making ketchup with high fructose corn syrup, but then also a huge variety of frozen French fries, when they figured out that they could work both ends of the processed food spectrum by creating products that people were losing control of, and then turning around and offering assistance through to those people, Heinz purchased none other than Weight Watchers, right? Probably the most famous of the diet programs. And the science on those programs is really hard. I mean, by their own reckoning, people on the best of those diet programs, including Weight Watchers, at best on average will lose 6% of their weight, and they'll give back 2 or 3% of that in the next year or two. So when I sort of realized that this industry is turned around and then is working the other side, right? Get them hooked and then get them hooked on diet. That is truly diabolical, because in that case, they're exploiting our efforts to regain control of our habits. And part of the way they're doing that, you see in parallel with other industries that create, addictive, problematic substances, whether it's cigarettes or the oil industry, is that they succeed in part by making us feel guilty, by making us feel it's our fault, by putting the responsibility and the onus on us to fix the problem. And that's what they're doing with the diet, the sort of owning the diet industry. And by the way, too, they just didn't buy up those schemes, those diet programs. They marched through the grocery store creating diet versions of their own products. So you had Nestle's Hot Pocket, and then you had the Lean Pocket sitting right next to it, which is maybe just like slightly less caloric, but I mean, as if we're supposed to stand there and decide, which one we needed on that particular shopping trip. Yeah.
Okay, let's make it slightly once I promise we'll redeem ourselves. But we are in France and we are in Europe, and France is known for its culinary ambiance and culture. And so I was reading for France as I read your book, and it came up a few times, but sadly also kind of negatively, which is, France is known for its long, slow meals, long lunches. There was a huge uproar when I think during the pandemic, Macron made at desk lunches, which had previously been illegal. You were now allowed to do that. And so in the end note, you cite a writer who's writing in 2019 that the time that the French spend eating lunch has plunged from an average of 80 minutes to 22 minutes. So we can even see I think 22 minutes is probably 5 times longer than an American will take for lunch. But still, even in a country like France, which is supposedly a buffer against the rampant speed of American capitalism, we can see this happening here. When you come to Europe, Michael, when you come to France, do you notice a difference? Is there hope in the streets of Paris?
Yeah, I still do. In fact, it's really interesting. I was giving a talk in Rome 2 weeks ago to the American Academy, where fellows sit around and have these wonderful meals prepared by their kitchen and crew who are into regenerative farming and being really creative and thoughtful about the food. And one of the fellows had issues with eating, overeating, sort of compulsive eating, and she said to me, when I come to Europe, that all kind of goes away. There's something about the love and the beauty and the appreciation of meals, food with meals, and there's so little snacking that kind of goes on here. I mean, the other day I saw somebody walking down the street with a fresh baguette, and she was starting to eat it walking down the street.
That's very classic.
That's an exception to the rule. Right. So in the US, you see people walking down and they're eating their entire lunch, like walking down the street, and or dinner and snacks in between. Right. That does seem to be that moment when we turn someday in the 80s, American parents stopped telling their kids not to snack in between meals. And that's kind of when you also saw people starting to eat continuously through the day. And I still think that here in Europe, that's still kind of unthinkable. Like, why in the world would you want to do something that would spoil in any way one of the most beautiful moments of the day, when you're sitting around having a meal with family or friends, and right, and wanting the appetite for that? I think that's still largely unfathomable here, but maybe it's changing, as we see in the supermarket down the street.
Okay, I want to leave time for questions.
Oh, great.
But let's talk about some of the final hopeful thoughts. And you mentioned at the end of your first book is you essentially, the argument is knowledge is power. And I think here too, your argument is knowledge is power, because we've talked about, we know that speed drives the brain crazy with lust. So we know that slowing things down will help kind of counteract that. We know, you write, that we're hardwired to be attracted to variety. So maybe we can change up our avocado toast as opposed to eating different colors of M&Ms. We know that we eat what we remember. So why not create new memories and then dig into those pathways? You say we know that they know that we're drawn to low cost. So we need to remember the hidden cost of cost. You've talked about this book for a while now. Are there any other pieces of advice that you would give?
Yeah, I think there then, and one of the interesting things about looking at food as an addiction and an addictive product, like other things, is that, I think there's some lessons you can draw from the world of other other addictive substances. And again, one of the things about addiction is it happens on a spectrum. And so depending kind of where you are in your relationship to food, your strategy for dealing with that is maybe different. If you're somebody who totally loses control of an Oreo cookie, like the former chief counsel of Philip Morris, then you're probably going to be somebody who completely abstains, right? Which is a word from drug addiction, right? You go cold turkey, you don't go anywhere near that product because you know there's no way you can control it. If you're somebody who's kind of problem with food or issue with food is that 3 p.m. craving that comes on, right? Where you're sitting at work or wherever, then there's some strategies you can adopt from the world of drug addiction that relate to understanding how powerful cravings are. I mean, when they hit you, they totally activate that go part of the brain, put the sleep part of the brain to sleep. So you have no choice in the matter. It's not about free will, personal responsibility. You're often running to satisfy that craving. And so the strategy in the world of other addictive substances is to do something, whether it's to get up and walk around the block or call a friend or eat a handful of nuts to ward off that craving. You do whatever your strategy is, you should be doing that at like 2:55 in order to ward off that 3 p.m. craving so you don't get hit by that. And then I think the biggest antidote to fast groceries for the vast, numbers of people whose problem with food is just kind of missing the love and beauty of home cooked meals is to slow down is to cook, which in essence is slowing down our whole relationship to food. And it doesn't have to be like a whole day thing, right? I usually give when people like protest and go, I don't have 5 hours to like cook a meal, I then will give them my 90-second recipe for spaghetti sauce, right? Which is real. And of course, if it simmers for a while, it'll be more attractive, but kids will be more apt to eat it. But nonetheless, this whole idea, I mean, the processed food industry coined the word convenience as a way of selling these products. And I think they've overhyped the convenience aspect of these foods. But I think that's the most challenging thing for people. I was at this conference a couple of weeks ago now in Torino called the Slow Food Movement. It's called Terra Madre and founded by this guy named Carlo who fought McDonald's in Italy back in the 80s. And they have these fabulous booths with people growing and producing incredible foods. But I said to him, I think one of the things people really need is the ability to plan and shop for and cook meals for their families that aren't too expensive, on a day in and day out basis, right? We need help in designing menus that won't wipe out our whole day or evening. So he's actually thinking about sort of incorporating that I think that'd be a really valuable thing to sort of help people, turn the tables on the food companies by slowing things down through cooking from scratch. I think it's a huge thing that we can do.
I wanted to ask you one more question that I hadn't planned to ask, but given that everyone here this evening is a woman apart from you, is it normally the case that most of your audience is filled with women?
Yeah. They're smarter, more caring, focused on that. Yeah, by and large, love food. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's pretty common.
Interesting. Can we have
and most of the CEOs and the top people in the companies are men, right? Who, as we know from salt, sugar, fat, don't eat their own products, right? They're designing it for us and because they know better, which was like a big revelation. Yeah.
True also of people who created all social media too. All the people who created Facebook, they don't use it, they don't have their kids use it. So I imagine if there are critiques of the argument, it would be jumping between these two industries so quickly, but there are very striking parallels that are illuminating. Think about, as we were talking about, the words consumption, convenience, that whether we jump from food to technology to, I mean, we could name others, fashion, or
Oh
talked
yeah,
about,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there are big parallels. There's, you know, fast fashion, fast film, fast travel. We were talking earlier, when Salt Sugar Fat came out, a guy came to visit me from Silicon Valley, and he had a copy of the book, and it was every page was underlined in three different color highlighters, and I go like, oh, you're really into food, aren't you? And he goes, not really. I'm trying to find ways to turn, you know, the tables on the tech industry. His job was to design the most highly addictive products there are out in the world of technology, and he was trying to switch sides and do things to help people unhook themselves on smartphones. And he goes like, your companies are doing the exact same things we are to get people hooked on our products. And one of the things he'd come up with really early on was to, you know, toggle the switch on your iPhone so it goes black and white. And when you do that, you're eliminating the color aspect, which is a real attraction in processed food. I mean, look at these packages. I mean, that color is just exciting your brain as we sit here.
But even when you just, I mean, what immediately jumped to my mind, even when you said, and this will be really the last thing I say. When you said that the on the one hand we have the part of the brain that's getting the hit, that's really exciting, the other part of the brain that's going to sleep, and so we can kind of mindlessly consume. It's just totally the same thing with phones, right? There's one part of your brain that's getting the micro doses of dopamine when you get a message, when you get a like, and then there's the other part of your brain that's going to sleep. It's when you look up and you've been on your phone for an hour, or you've eaten the whole box of Oreos, or you've done both at the same time. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for Michael?
Thank you.
I imagine there are questions in the room, and for which I will. I can do it. Questions in the room? Oh yes. Questions?
We were talking about writing earlier too, by the way, so we could totally delve into.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, I'm French. I was born and raised here, and it's very interesting. And it's half a question, half a comment. Oreos, I didn't grow up with those at all. It was just this American thing that kept on popping up in films, and hence was cool. And then slowly, the only place that was available, that was in the Haagen-Dazs ice creams and cooking cream. I guess that's what it was. And when I left for the States and came back, and I saw that they created basically, I mean, some of the commercials were basically about reminding us how childhood tasted around Oreos. And it's like, it's not part of our childhood. It's something you just completely made up.
Yeah.
And it actually created this connection, kind of like the connection that a lot of countries have with the sense of Americana or something.
Right.
And that completely just wrap this thing with, they don't even need to put much. I mean, it's Oreos and that's it. I mean, when I look at the box, it's very simple compared to other cereals that are.
So you think they've woven it into the collective memory of, I mean, are you now remembering your childhood of Oreos when in fact you didn't?
I'm very aware of that,
subconsciously,
like, how it's different because I'm not that, I was a little older. Maybe younger kids might not really know it might be very blurry. And also I feel like all these things are basically products that we don't need and that make a lot of money. And I mean, I'm a little negative about this. Like, how can companies do something else than use more and more powerful tools in order to make us either addicted or creating false memories?
Well, just on the memory thing, they've done experiments where they have realized they can implant memories into people just through advertising, and show people ads, and they will then think they saw something when they didn't, and so they can trick them into thinking, you know, that they actually have experienced that. And so probably some of that is what's going on there with that.
Any other questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. There's also this powerful McDonald's ad, and I've never eaten McDonald's, but it has to do with an inner child, and it's quite compelling. But the other thing was, what about developing countries and the concept of status as well? Like when I was in medical school, I traveled to Laos, and there were some pediatricians there, and nobody spoke English. but they were basically lots of women who were quite poor, who would otherwise be breastfeeding, but they felt the most strongest thing to do was to buy, it wasn't even breast milk, it was coffee creamer with a picture of a babe, a bear holding a baby. And it was Nestle that was promoting this product. And the pediatricians were finding that the babies were malnourished because the women were feeding, thinking that they were doing the right thing, thinking that this was a better sort of American product, feeding it to the babies.
Yeah.
And it obviously didn't have any nutritional value for the babies.
Yeah, Nestle took a lot of heat for that, and they would sort of argue, well, the water quality was bad, so it's, you know, it's maybe safer to drink our infant formula. What you do see, though, is in parallel with tobacco, when the U.S. began pushing on the tobacco companies in the mid-90s, their response was to quickly settle the litigation, but then also quietly start moving overseas and focusing their marketing efforts in other countries. And you see the exact same thing with processed food. So it makes more sense to them to sort of invest marketing dollars in places like Brazil, where there's an emerging middle class, rather than kind of keep fighting it out in, you know, Dubuque, Iowa, for people who are maybe starting to become aware of the dangers of their products. And you see these American style products spreading all over the world now, as you know, with an accompanying rise in, you know, in food related health trouble. Yeah, they'll go wherever the biggest potential market is for them, and even, you know, and even better if it's in places where there's no government regulation. Yeah.
Other questions in the room? Yes.
Oh, it was kind of,
Just
well,
quickly for those on Zoom, the question is, we're asking what got him interested in this investigative journalism. Yes, go ahead.
yeah, it was kind of accident. I was writing about terrorism in the war in Iraq, and I got in some trouble, and I had to come home and find something else to write about. And in a way, it was kind of going from one war to another. In the case of the Iraq situation, I was tormenting the Pentagon for failing to equip American soldiers with like body armor, American soldiers being just like poor and working class kids who were there because they needed a job. And in this case, you know, we have these big corporations dominating our eating habits. And in some ways it's a much bigger war that we found ourselves in, and trying to, you know, keep control of our eating habits in the face of these products and the effort by the industry. So there's some real parallels between the two. Only in the sense that war reporting is dangerous to my health. Yeah.
States, and
Right.
I didn't, I mean, and
Yeah.
didn't eat much cheese, but I became literally addicted to cheese in France. So I'm addicted to cheese. Now, has a lot of salt in it,
Right.
but is it, you know, what happens when you become addicted to quote unquote good food?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And you know, I think what, you know, what can trigger people to lose control of their food, you know, is it can be really variable. In fact, that's one of the things that the food companies said to defend themselves way back when, was that, look, people can get addicted to carrots, and but yet in the scheme of things, I mean, to live in the United States and be an environment where, I mean, and to be somebody who loses control over much of the stuff in the grocery store, it's kind of like an alcoholic living in a bar. I mean, it's the constant marketing and the selling of that product to you. At least French cheese isn't dirt cheap, right? I mean, it hits you a little bit in the pocketbook, right? Which maybe might offer some resistance on your part. But if, for example, you were living in an environment where just every billboard and every commercial on television was selling you dirt cheap cheese, maybe you'd have an even a harder time kind of regaining control over that. But on the other hand, yeah, there's something about the salt and the fat, even in good products that may be problematic for you.
Other questions in the room? Yes, coming back around.
That's good. Yeah, because that's where the millions are. Absolutely.
Hi, that just made me think of something when you're talking about price and everything, like food stamps in the United States and stuff like that. You can't afford to buy these very wonderful natural vegetables and this, that, and the other. You have to go for the Chef Boyardee lasagna or whatever.
Right.
What can be a solution to that?
Yeah.
Because the
So
government
right. So
doesn't pay for you to be healthy.
yeah, so that's one of the problems. I mean, you can walk in the store and be well-meaning by yourself and your family, but the fact is that pint of blueberries, especially off-season, is going to cost as much as a 2-pound 4 meat 3 cheese frozen pizza that's going to feed the whole family. And so, what are you going to do? Absolutely, it's one of the biggest inequities in the whole situation. Is that good food kind of almost invariably costs more than the trouble food. And so to change that, you have to have a complete change in the agricultural system. I mean, 90% of the farmland in the United States is growing soybeans and field corn as essential ingredients for processed food. And the rest of the 10% is growing all the vegetables and nuts and fruits, the things we should be eating much more of in terms of portion of the diet. So that would require a top-down policy change. But the fact is that the Department of Agriculture, which regulates and guides the food industry, is working for the processed food industry, and not you, the consumer, and your health. That's the basic problem.
More questions? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean,
What's the solution?
I often dream. So, what's the solution to this? I mean, and I often dream of, like, if I was a king for the day, I would take like one zip code in New York and change maybe 10 different things, because I think that there is no easy answer. But you would start with the kids, right? You would plant a garden in the school, not to feed them necessarily, but to get them excited about something like a radish, right? But then you'd have to work on the supply and the grocery store access, because they're going to bring that radish home and get their parents excited. But then where are they going to find that radish, and how are they going to be able to afford it when they do find it? So you have to sort of work on the food desert problem, and on and on till you get to the point where the parent is trying to design a menu that'll last for the whole week and keep the family excited and interested. And so you're going to have to figure out ways to help people relearn how to plan and shop and cook, in a reasonable sort of modern environment where maybe both parents are working 2 jobs and there's limited income. So yeah, I think that the answer, unfortunately, is really complex, and you have to do a bunch of things probably all at the same time.
I'm hesitant to say anything. I am a self-professed food addict, and I feel strongly that each one of us knows inside whether we overdo it or not. And I certainly was in denial for most of my life. And if I waited until those jackasses changed their way of selling stuff, I probably would be dead. And so I really feel the solution is up to me, that if I know food is killing me, and it was, and I spent a lot of money binging. So I think I'm a real low bottom person, but I'm shaking. I just had to look in the mirror and tell the truth to myself, and then do whatever it took. And I had to join other food addicts because I couldn't do it alone. It was too powerful. So I really appreciate that you're now willing to use the word addiction and food addiction, because it's people like me can come out of the closet. You know, everybody would go smile at me like food's not a big issue. For me, it was killing me. And I was very, I don't want to say anymore, but I really think for all of us, we can, and if we all stop eating that shit, they might change their way of.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And I appreciate how you see the opportunity to change within yourself. But I think what I also point out to people is that, you know, it's not a matter of free will. It's not a matter of you not having willpower, the same amount of willpower as somebody else. These companies are designed in a way that destroys willpower and free will and our ability to kind of make rational decisions. So my whole effort has been sort of, you know, putting, you know, at least part of that responsibility on the companies who design these products.